Okay, welcome. Thank you for attending our session today. The session is named Certified Efficiency or a Journey Through a Passive House Construction and Certification. My name is Vlad Pezel. I'll be talking about my own home that I've built and certified. And the specifics about certification is that it took 7 years after we moved in. So that makes the story a little bit more interesting. And today with me is Matt Bowers, a certifier who will provide his perspective and point of view on the certification process. So Matt, welcome.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Like Vlad said, my name is Matt Bowers. I'm the president of Rochester Passive House Consulting. I'm a trainer with the Passive House Network. So I do training with the designer course and the tradesperson course. I'm also a certifier with Certifiers Cooperative. And back in 2016, I built my own passive house and got it certified. So I like to be able to bring a little bit of perspective from the builder to the designer all the way through the certifier. And my goal here is to just kind of put a little bit of certifier perspective to Vlad's journey here. So I look forward to speaking with you. And let's get started.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, that certifies perspective would have been very useful for us when we went through the certification journey, and I'm looking forward to Matt's comments on this. So to begin our journey, how did we decide to learn about Passive House and actually build one for ourselves? And then 7 years later, how did we decide to certify it? And that's the crux of this presentation. And on top of all that, as a result of certification and building this home, I've changed my career as well into passive house consultancy and energy modeling. So the reasons for learning about a passive house and ultimately building and certifying was in our lack of comfort and health. We lived in a traditionally built home in the 70s and 80s here in the US. And we thought the main reason was actually we're spending too much money on energy. But in effect, it was the comfort we were after. And we were paying too much money for unattainable comfort. It was never warm enough in the winter. And it was never cool enough in the summer. And as you can see from some of the images here on the slide, there were ice dams and icicles forming on our roofs and in front of our windows in the winter, in the cold Boston winters. In effect, we had to turn off our heat off during some of the coldest nights. We had a heat pump which was not able to keep up with the demand, and it would blow just lukewarm or cool air during the night, not even reaching 68 degrees Fahrenheit inside of the home. So for that reason, we had to turn it off. It was more comfortable to not have the heat blow the cool air through the registers. On top of that, there was no substantial insulation in some of the walls or ceilings. Renovating the kitchen, I found out there is no insulation on the outside wall and also on the party walls between us and our neighbors. And often the pipes would freeze in the winter on the party walls. Changing the light bulbs in the recessed lighting would blow a cold air in my face. And every winter I would suffer some kind of a respiratory infection, and I guess that the forced air would just circulate some pollutants and pathogens. So there must be a better way, but what was it? So I set off on a journey to try to find out what is the alternative and better way of building and living instead of a traditionally built homes here in the US. So doing some research, so just to be clear, this is about 10 years ago, in 2011, 2012 is when this whole process started. I heard and learned about something that's called a passive house, but what was it? I learned that it comes from Europe or from Germany, but is it here in the States? Who's doing it? Are there any homes or any builders or anybody that can help us build a more energy efficient home? So one day I ran across an article in Boston Globe um, titled "The Home is Where the Heat is Off," and somebody was building an energy efficient home in a suburb of Boston. So I went through the article and I read it with great interest and tried to find out who these people are, and managed to get in touch with Simon O'Hare, who was building his own home. He was a founder of a design build company, Place Tailor, which is pretty prominent here in the Boston area today. But in those days, it was only Simon and Declan Keefe who were the founders, and they were testing their newly acquired knowledge on building his own small home. So I invited those guys to meet, and they showed up in a neighborhood cafe on bicycles. There were architects in training, not even graduated yet, who were swinging hammers, and they learned about the passive house. They wanted to build homes to that principle, and we were hooked at that moment. And as you can see from the lower right image on my slide, this is one of their bikes as they were building our home. They were coming to the construction site on bicycles. They didn't own any vehicle or any truck. So all the materials, all the tools, everything was delivered to the site and they would come by bikes. So that was a quite peculiar group of builders that we liked. So where we started, an infill lot, urban lot that we wanted to repurpose and build our home on. It was a pretty rundown, a local garbage dump, but location was ideal, so we just went for it. Early days of deciding on the design on what to build, we could see that the Simon and Declan and the crew were well versed in passive house at the time. They took the training. They were using PHPP. It was version 1 at a time. They also had a certified passive house trades person on as a part of our crew. So they gained confidence, for me and my wife that they can really do a good job. So what they were producing as an initial design, initial calculations were very promising.
So usually this is around the time that you would want to engage a certifier. And from a certifier's perspective, to know that the team is experienced and has done the training and is well versed in what they're going to need to supply is really going to go a long way to getting a really good price for certification. Generally, I mean, the price for certification is really going to be based on how much time the certifier thinks they're going to need to certify the building, to do any trainings that might be necessary for the team, and then to review all of the materials. So really, the more information that you can supply, usually the better the price for certification is going to be.
That's a great comment, Matt. At the time, we were aiming to go for certification. A certified passive house designer as part of the team was doing the calculations, and that was the intent. But there was no speak of engaging a certifier. I think it would have been really beneficial at that time to keep those guys in check and us on track all the way, and hopefully not making any big mistakes in the beginning.
Sure. It probably wouldn't have taken 8 years either.
Right, right. So we'll get to that point. How did the certification happen 8 years later? So the construction started in earnest about a year after we engaged with a design build firm because of the permitting process and all of that. It takes some time in these urban areas. However, I think construction was progressing well. They were using some really innovative and promising methods. You can see in the upper left corner, the foundation consisted of two pieces, actually, the outer stem wall or the frost wall was separated from the inner shallow concrete ring beam. And since it was a double stud wall construction, the outside 2x6 wall was resting on a stem wall, and the inside 2x4 wall was resting on the TGIs, which were resting on the inner shallow ring beam. So that provided a lot of space below the floor joists to be filled with cellulose. In addition to the depth of the TGIs, which were almost 12 inches, there was some space below them. In some places, almost 4 to 5 inches of space below that was also filled with cellulose. At the time, I guess some calculations were made in PHPP in terms of how much insulation thickness would be needed in the floors and walls and in ceiling. And I remember as we progressed, the walls actually got thinner at some point because the calculations showed that we don't need that much wall thickness and that much insulation to achieve the passive house results as they were calculating at the time. So they were trained in installing the membranes. You can see the weather resistant barrier on the outside and the vapor control layer on the inside, all carefully taped. I was responsible for selecting the windows and sourcing the windows from Europe, triple pane, European windows. They were not Passive House certified. That manufacturer didn't have a Passive House certified window at a time. So this was their top of the line. And that has proven to be a difficulty later on in obtaining all the information necessary for the certification.
So Vlad has done a fantastic job here using his camera and getting the necessary photo documentation. And usually when we're approached for a certification project that has been completed already, a lot of times the stopping point is there isn't enough photo documentation. So by engaging the certifier before construction starts, what we're able to do is issue the team a list of photographs. There's some standard photographs that we're going to want to see, but after having done a full model review, there might be some interesting junctures that we want to see some photos of that we think might be a little bit more complex to build, or to extra detailing around certain fenestrations and things. So usually the photo documentation is a real hurdle for a lot of teams that aren't familiar with it and haven't engaged a certifier early enough. So, but great job. It helps that it was your own project, so you're standing out there with the camera because you want to do some personal documentation, which is perfect. Kudos to you for being able to handle all of that for sure.
Exactly. Great point, Matt. That was one of the biggest concerns as I was starting the certification process. Do I have enough of documentation? And as I was taking these pictures, I wasn't thinking of a certification at the time. As you say, Matt, it was more me documenting the whole process for my own purpose and just being curious because I was not at the site every day, so I wanted to keep progress as they were building. So as the construction was progressing, um, about 11 months after it started, the home was complete. We loved what we got. We were anxious to move in. You can see this images from early February. We moved in early April. It's always, punch lists and some little details that prevent you to move in, even though it looks like it's almost ready. Um, so we were eager to move in, and at that time, somehow the certification was pushed on the side. It was a little bit of construction fatigue, I would say, for both the builder and for us. We were eager to start living in a brand new, beautiful home. I think they were eager to move on to a next project. And at that stage, we kind of said to each other, okay, maybe we'll talk about trying to certify this soon. Um, so we moved into our house, and for some time we were not really thinking about, is it a passive house? But about a year later, I started thinking about, okay, we built ourselves, quote unquote, a passive house, but is it really a passive house? That was a question I was not able to answer because it wasn't certified. So, so years kind of passed with me not doing much about that. Um, we're enjoying living in the home. Um, and I was kind of tracking, the performance or how much we were spending or how many kilowatt hours we were consuming to make ourselves comfortable in the home. And through some of my back of the envelope calculations, it looked like it was in the ballpark or in the range of a passive house. But it would be useful to have a certifier at that time, on our side to provide some guidance.
This is always fun, right? Digging into the numbers and comparing how the house is actually performing to what it was designed to be, how it was designed to perform. So I've done this with my personal house, right? I track my heating and cooling and total energy use and a few other appliances, right? Hot water and a few other things. So I love looking at this kind of data just to see how the house is actually performing, because in the end, that's what we're all really looking for, right? Um, but we want to be able to, commission the house as a whole project. So I love being able to look at this kind of data, for sure.
Right. And as you and I spoke before this presentation, Matt, you pointed to me that maybe some of my calculations were not entirely right. Um,
Yeah. So one of the things, and it's a very, very common mistake, particularly when you are um, doing this on measuring actual energy, but the annual heating and cooling demand is a demand for the house. It's not how much your heat pump is using. So annual heating and cooling demand is just the demand of the house. So when you're measuring how many kilowatt hours your heat pump is using, we need to account for the COP of the heat pump, the average COP over the course of the heating or cooling season, to actually get where the house is performing. So usually we have to divide what your meter or multiply what your meter reading is by what the COP of that equipment is for
mhm.
that season.
Right. So maybe at that time, if we have done that, maybe my performance data wouldn't have been as good, and I wouldn't engage maybe down this path. But I think the primary energy was kind of looking good. Um, and I wanted also to point with these images here that we like it warm in our home, right? We were not setting it to the PHI standard of 68 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
As you can see, we were setting it to 73. Um, and maybe we just, were tired of living in a cool and uncomfortable home before this. so we're enjoying this a little bit more
We
warmth.
find that a lot, even in just standard weatherization projects, right? Because everybody's always looking for payback. And fact of the matter is, when the house is more comfortable, you're not afraid to pump that thermostat up 1 or 2 degrees to be at the comfort level that you would expect. So yeah, that all, there's a lot of variables that go into that.
Right. Great perspective. Thanks, Matt. So with these encouraging data, and me being at the at the point where I wanted to change my career and switching from a corporate world into something that has more meaning to this situation we're in with climate change and energy skyrocketing prices, I decided to train myself. And 7 years later, after we moved in and completed our home, I took Certified Passive House Consultant course here in Newton, Massachusetts, and I was fortunate enough to be trained by one of the very experienced practitioners from the New York City area, and I learned a lot during this course. It was a 5-day intensive course that just gives you a little bit of foundation, I would say, and it gives you a direction where you can go and further perfect and improve your skills. But I think it gave me more confidence to start thinking about certifying my own home. And as I was taking this course, I was talking to the instructor and some other people in the group just to gauge their feeling about whether it's possible or not to try to certify a home after completion of construction and 7 years after completion of some construction. And I've met with some um, not so assuring, I would say, commentary, but they were all curious to see if I would be successful in the end or not. But that kind of didn't prevent me from you know to keep thinking about this and see what it takes to certify your own home.
And that's wonderful that you were able to do that. And again, from the certifier perspective, if I was approached by someone who built a house 7 years ago and is just now taken the designer course, I might be a little hesitant to either take the project on or do any kind of promising that we're going to be able to get this completed. So that's awesome that you were able to and had the drive to get it certified this way, given those obstacles.
It wasn't without trepidation, Matt. Let me tell you that.
Right.
So I decided to start looking into that. So how do you certify a home? And speaking with some practitioners from the area and from New York City area, they pointed me, of course, to the PHI's website and got me in contact with some of the certifiers, not really in the proximity here. But going through the information that I found at the PHI's site about certification, I was getting more and more knowledge about what it takes to do that. I think their documentation is excellent. It explains the steps. It illustrates the type of documentation you need to create, the type of images that you need to take, and it looked not insurmountable, even though I was newly trained certified passive house designer, if you will. I would say that with some hesitancy, I decided to see if I can do this. And I would say that if I had some help from a certified at that time, I think it would have been much easier.
Yeah. There are now a number of certifiers in North America, both in Canada and the US, and in every time zone. And if anyone is interested in kicking the tires on certification out there, I would check out the North American Certifier Circle, or NACC. It's basically all of the certifiers in North America or who certify buildings in North America. to find a certifier who might work best for your project. So certainly check that out. And also this criteria for Passive House. I'm going to put a link in the chat right now to this document. It really is really helpful for anybody who hasn't gone through the certification process. There's a checklist in there and some other links to sample documents. And it gives you a really, really good example of what the expectation is in terms of documentation for your project. So certainly check this out.
Thanks, Matt. So yes, so with this knowledge of what I need to do to even apply for certification, I kind of set off down this path to create this documentation. And looking at what my builder has left behind him after they completed a home, it was a set of paper construction drawings that I looked at, and I looked at what PHI is requiring in terms of the details that should be on those drawings and cross sections and all that, and it wasn't sufficient. So I understood that I needed to do this myself. So I acquired, or I bought Google SketchUp and started to learn how to use it. And first, I had to create a 3D model of my own home from the drawings that were left behind. And I was running around the home for about a few months with a tape measure in my hand, just double checking the measurements, because I also learned that some things were not exactly built to the construction drawing. So I didn't have the as-built drawings either. Needless to say, this process took some time, a couple of months in the summer of 2020. So I took the course in this early spring of 2020, just as COVID was ramping up here in the States. And as we completed the course and the exam was set for, I think, late March or early April 2020, everything closed up. And the exam was postponed. So it was postponed a few months, I think for June or July. Then it was postponed again in July until October. And I think it was a good thing that I decided to try to certify this myself, because I didn't want to wait for the exam to take place and for me to get certified. So I wasn't even certified as a consultant or a designer, but I was still trying to see if I can certify my own home, because this is an alternate path to obtain your credentials through successfully certifying a project. So there was a lot of risk and a lot of learning that needed to take place here. And again, I would have been better off if I had a help of a certified that was standing next to me.
But I'll tell you, you did a really good job with just these two details that we're looking at on the screen right here. I'll tell you, certifiers love color. And if you can supply colors in your ventilation design and in your air barrier and your WRB design, and your window installation details and all of that, the more colors that you can use, the more clear it is, and the less time it's going to take us to go through and try to figure out the thought process of the team. And you're absolutely right that you don't need to take the exam to become a certified designer or consultant, but that's usually the path that most people take. But again, someone was putting some roadblocks in front of you, and you were persistent enough to work through this process, and hats off to you for doing that. So the project documentation to get to become a certified designer is on PHI's website, and that's certainly another path that you can take. And usually that's what people do when their certification expires, is they'll renew their certification by project documentation. So great job.
Right. Thank you so much. It wasn't without risk and and uncertainty, but still, I wanted to try to see how far I can get. So yeah, so other types of documentation. As I was going down the list of PHI certification document guide and the examples of documentation you need to create, I was just checking them off one by one, learning how to calculate TFA and document a TFA that certifier would accept. In addition to that, also the length of hot water pipes was another type of documentation there. A 3D model helped a lot to route them and measure their lengths. I also want to mention that help from the community was invaluable. During COVID, sitting in a room, not really meeting other people on construction sites or other events, public events, just the online events and the contacts were really helpful to gain valuable advice on how to do certain things. How to calculate VN50, for example, or what's the difference between VV and VN50, and how to document and present them to the certifier.
This is just fantastic documentation here. It's really important to be able to support all of the information that's going into the PHPP one way or the other, whether it's documented on the prints or if it's documented in a 3D model. However it's going to be documented, the more clear you can make it for the certifier, the better off it's going to be, and the quicker the overall process will be when you engage a certifier. And calculating VN50, for example, is usually one of those things where when we're reviewing a PHPP, there's just a number in a cell, and we need to know where that number came from. So being able to show exactly where that number came from, like you've done in the upper right-hand corner here, is just it's great, really, really good.
Thanks, Matt. I'm glad you approve of it, and PHI did as well, fortunately. So marching down the documentation, actually marching down the PHPP through the various tabs, you learn that you need a calculator provide certain type of information, and you get to the shading tab, and you can do it in the traditional way of entering the depths of reveals and distances from the shading objects, from all the windows. However, a better way to do that is to use Design PH, which is a plugin created by PHI that works together with Google SketchUp to do shading, among other things. It can do a quick calculation of your project and tell you whether it will satisfy the passive house criteria with the parameters that you input into the program. But for shading, it's really invaluable because it uses ray tracing program to calculate the shading for winter and summer for all your windows that you can just export out of Design PH and import into your PHPP in a few quick steps. That also required some learning, acquiring that piece of software and taking some courses before I was able to provide the numbers to input into PHPP.
So Design PH, while it's certainly not required for certification, will usually result in a lower certification cost simply because of the shading algorithm. As a certifier, checking the shading tab in PHPP can really take a long time, especially if there are a number of windows. If there are 50 or 60 windows in the project, forget about it. So using Design PH is probably going to save you money in certification costs, just due to the shading algorithm.
All right. Yeah, it helped me. It helped me a lot.
It is also important to tell the certifier, if you're using Design PH, what the shading settings are when you export, because there are a number of combinations and they all give you a little bit different information, a percentage point here or there. So just make sure that you let the certifier know what your shading settings were when you did the export.
Right. Is it also helpful if a Design PH model is shared with a certifier, so
Oh,
certifier can?
yeah, absolutely. Share the Design PH model. It not only helps with the shading, but it also can point you to potential thermal bridge locations. And I think we're going to be getting into that next.
Right, right. Yes, great point. Okay, so marching down the types of documentation and information that is needed for certification, we're coming to thermal bridges, right? So that was another area that needed to be conquered, if you will, or learned, another software that I've acquired. And I started working down the list of thermal bridges on my own home. First identifying them, identified 34 of them, and then deciding which ones to do. And I've started with, uh, you know, typical ones of window sills, outside corners and perimeter and so on. So I'm showing here a few examples of window sills, operable windows on my home, and they ended up being thermal bridge free. I think the limit is 0.006 BTUs per hour foot Fahrenheit in IP units, or zero point zero 0.01 if I'm not mistaken, and in SI units. And this is a testament to the construction crew and the designer of the design build company doing the right thing in this particular sense. So I was really happy to calculate this type of result.
So thermal bridges are always a fun conversation to have with the certifier. The certifier will usually point you to a few that you might need to do, either because they're going to be super positive just because of geometry, or if there's a risk of interior surface temperature being not meeting the hygiene requirement, which is your FRSI calculation. So really, there are two reasons to have to do them. Again, one is for the interior surface temperature, and then the other is to correct the heating demand and cooling demand calculation in the PHPP. So usually you don't have to do all of them. You certainly can, but usually the certifier will point you to the handful that you might need to do in a project.
Right. Yeah, this would have helped me here, I think, greatly, because I ended up doing all 34 of them because I didn't have that guidance. And I also was curious to see, whether my home hasn't made any, home builder hasn't made any big mistakes, or I don't have any, big thermal bridges that would prevent me from, achieving certification in the end. And also, I took advantage of a bunch of negative values from all those thermal bridge calculations that, in the end, I think provided a complete performance picture of my home, um, and actually gave me assurance that what was built um, would satisfy the criteria. And there were moments when the value is kind of teetering, around 4.75 in IP units, or 15 in the SI units. And then there are moments when you enter some values and it falls below the limit, so you're full of jubilation, and then you continue calculating, you enter some more values, and it jumps over the limit, and then it's despair. So what do? I mean, you just kind of continue entering everything that you calculate, everything that's needed, um, to see in the end if it passes or not.
Yeah. So yeah, I feel your excitement when you get, oh yes, this one's going to be negative. What does this do? And then you get another one that's positive. You're like, oh,
Right.
I'm over the limit again. No, I
Right.
totally understand that feeling. Um, Very rarely do you need to do all 34. However, like you said, um, doing 34 thermal bridges might be less expensive than adding an extra inch of insulation all the way around the building, right? Or adding, upgrading the windows or upgrading the ventilation system to the higher efficiency to meet the heating demand. Maybe doing the 34 thermal bridges, if they're relatively similar, is more cost effective because it's going to, in the end with the negative ones, potentially lower your heating demand just as much as maybe the air tightness or the extra insulation might. So it's certainly something to consider. I would be upfront with the certifier if if we're doing a single family home and someone dumped 34 psi values or thermal bridge calculations on my desk. That might change things a little bit because it's a little bit
Right.
more documentation to review, but still, you're in the end, you're going to get a much more accurate, um, energy model.
Yes, that was my thinking, and also, curiosity to see whether everything was, how was it done? Was it done properly or not? But great perspective. Thanks there, Matt. Um, all right, so marching down the type of documentation, of course, the blower door test result. And the blower door test was done twice, fortunately. The first one was just as the external, the house was buttoned up, I guess. There were not all doors in it, I believe. I think all the windows were in, the membranes were put in, and the guys wanted to see whether, where they are. And the first blower door test came just under the limit of 0.6. I think that was a point of jubilation on all of our part. But the second blower door test was done just before moving in, and it gave a good result. At the time, it gave a result of 0.33. And I want to kind of clarify this a little bit. I did have that result on me, but checking the PHPP work of the previous designer and the design build crew, I caught some errors in calculating VN50 that Matt has mentioned earlier. And I had to contact uh, the um, the the company that did the blower door test. Luckily, they had their documentation still on file, and they were able to pull it up. And I provided the updated information to them about BN50 volume area, and they've updated their results. And still, the blower door test came to 0.43, which is a passing value. So that was another close call, if you will, on getting all the necessary documentation and getting the results that you need to be able to certify.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that would have been the first thing that would have thrown up a flag for me is, okay, you did the blower door test, 7-8 years ago at this point. Was the VN50 correct? And you've said obviously that it wasn't. It's great that they were still able to provide that information. In the link that I already put in the chat, there is sample documents for everybody to take a look at. And one of the sample documents is what they're looking for a blower door test report. So I would certainly recommend, if you've never done a pressurization and a depressurization test, to take a look at that report as to what is required on it. And another comment, so there's I do a lot of blower door tests as well. And the picture on the left here, it's really cool to see a duct leakage tester testing a whole house. Like that's just amazing. A fan that's designed to test leakage in ductwork is being used to test leakage in an entire building. So that's really cool to see. And the other really cool thing to see is in the picture on the right here, they're using the D ring for the energy conservatory equipment. That's a special order ring. And I have one and I've used it 3 times in the past 10 years. So, to be part of that D-ring club is certainly something to hang your hat on. That's great. And then looking at the report, right, the CFM 50 going through the fan was 91 CFM on average, which is that's a good sized bath fan. So that's really, really impressive to be able to meet the air tightness requirement on a relatively small building. So great job.
Great. So that D-ring is it's a testament to the low flow that it's required for that test.
Yeah, exactly. So the way that the blower door works is the manometer is measuring 2 different pressures, the pressure of the fan and then the pressure difference between the inside and the outside of the house. So in order for the manometer to get a reading, it needs to have a minimum fan pressure. And in order for the minimum fan pressure to be to be over its threshold, we need to decrease the free area of the fan. So by making the hole smaller, we can ramp up the fan speed and increase the fan pressure so that we can get a more accurate test. So the smaller the hole, the better.
Right. Great. All right. So coming close to the end of completing the documentation, PHPP being filled in along the way in the past 3 or 4 months of gathering the documentation, calculating and entering it. And there were always some moments where you run into the type of information you need to provide, but it requires some auxiliary calculations. And there was a case of heat pump performance calculation. The heat pump that was purchased and used on my home was about 10 years old. The model was kind of older model, not on the market anymore at that time. So I had some struggle to find the performance information for my particular heat pump. It was a Mitsubishi heat pump, but that particular model not being sold anymore. And PHI's website and their tools for calculating the heat pump performance was really useful in this instance. I think a certifier would have been really helpful in moments like that when you kind of hit the wall.
Yeah, the certifier is a great resource for the how do I model this question. Right? How do I model an overhead door? Right? How do I model this threshold detail? How do I model this special transition, or how do I model this heat pump? And so, even if you're not seeking certification, being able to bounce some of these how do I model this questions off of a certifier is really an invaluable tool just to make sure that your energy model is accurate. There are thousands of inputs into PHPP, and if you mess up 1 decimal just by accident, it really could throw off the whole energy model and leave somebody upset. So certainly, yeah, engaging a certifier, even if you're not seeking certification, is a real useful tool.
Exactly. I think there were moments when um, of uncertainty. First, will it meet the criteria? And even if it did, towards the end of completing all the documentation, so it looked good. It was about 14, kilowatt hours per square meter annually, or 4.5, let's say, in IP units. Somebody to look over this whole documentation and your model, to verify if you've done everything correctly would have been really useful. So that level of uncertainty added additional risk for me to pursue certification, because there is a fee involved, of course, with certification. What if, that fee is paid up front, right? So what if it doesn't satisfy that criteria? So that's a risk that needs to be taken into account.
And that is part of the reason PHI did issue the low energy building standard for those projects that just either barely miss it for one reason or the other. There's still some sort of something you get for the fee of certification. So there's certainly low energy building to look at. But as everyone can see on the screen right now, you, you didn't meet low energy building. Passive House Plus is a fantastic achievement, and it's really a testament to all of the hard work that you put in to documenting everything that was done to the house, doing all of those thermal bridge calculations. Yeah, Passive House Plus is a feather in your cap. Way to go!
Thank you, Matt. Yes, it was a great result in the end. Great satisfaction to reach that certification, and as a reward for all the hard work, not just mine, but also for the builder of the home. So I've shared these results with the builder that has, certainly moved on to other projects after that. But I think it was really worth it for me as an owner or a newly minted, let's say, passive house designer, or somebody who's living in a house for 7 years before wanting to know, is it really a passive house? So a couple of reasons for that. Have I been sold a home that is a passive house or not a passive house? So what did we pay for, right? Have all the details been executed correctly or as planned? Have all the calculations or materials or choice of materials or craftsmanship, has it been up to the standard or not, which is, tested through blower door tests, or which is tested, through simulations on the overall house performance. And I want to say also, if I'm somebody who's buying a passive house, I would look at the passive house that is certified versus the one that it says, well, it's built to the principle, but who is to say that it is actually close or it is performing as a passive house unless you certify and check it and test all that. And for that, you need to engage with professionals like Matt that will guide you along the way and help you make that certification.
Yeah, certification is a learning experience, usually for everybody involved, including the certifier. We're constantly learning new tricks, new processes, and new methods, and instituting new materials and things like that into different projects. So it's really a learning experience for everybody involved. And if you haven't gone through it yet, I certainly recommend it, again, even for a project that's not going to meet certification, just to go through the process and learn the process is going to make you a better designer. It's going to make you a better tradesperson. It's going to make you a better certifier with the more projects that you can be involved with. So, great job. And I'm sure, I mean, as you said, you learned a lot and enough that this is what you're doing now.
Exactly. Yes, this kind of opened up a new career for me, and I'm really pleased with the result, and I'm happy to be engaged in this type of work. And we want to thank you for your attention and for the time you're given to us to explain our process and the benefits of engaging a certifier through this process. So, if I may say, don't do it like me. Don't do what I do, but do what I say. And my advice is to certify your next project and to engage a certifier early in the process so you don't have to fend off the risks and uncertainty that I have experienced throughout my process.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to the two of us go on for about an hour here. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot them into the chat here, and we can get started with a little bit of Q&A. So I look forward to speaking with everybody further, and thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Matt Bowers here, and I'm here with Vlad, and we're here to kind of take some of your questions. And there have been a couple here that have come up through the chat that I think we'd like to touch on here. Early in the presentation, a question came in from Jay, and he had a question. I guess it was on payback. And so I'll let Vlad touch on that one a little bit. Payback, based on certification, or based on building a passive house. So I think we can, between you and I, Vlad, touch on a little bit of both of those.
Sure, we can. Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching the presentation. So payback from a point of view of an owner or self-builder who built my own home. Building passive house was a no-brainer for me. On top of that, the premium for building passive house was not really that excessive. I think it was just a few percent, maybe 4 to 5. And I wasn't really thinking about payback at all at that time. I was thinking about, how do we keep comfortable during the winter? My wife and I like it warm. And, how does this house, how is it going to provide us with a nice, healthy, fresh air, infused, warm environment for us to, go through Boston winters, and also reduce um, our energy bills, as you have seen from the beginning of the presentation. It was, one of the major problems. We were paying too much for unattainable comfort. Payback for certification. I guess the motives could be, manifold. Number one is I want to know, have I gotten what I paid for? When I engaged with the builder, they said, we'll build you a passive house. Did you really deliver me a passive house in the end? Took me 7 years to try to come up with the answer for that. And fortunately, it was a positive answer. Maybe another reason would be if you're selling your home and you say it's built to passive house principles versus this is a certified passive house with credentials and a plaque and everything, I think you can, attract more buyers that way. And thirdly, if you don't certify, that means you don't have another set of eyes that are independent from your design build firm or your designer that has no interest, financial interest in building this home for you. They're really looking out for quality in your home. And if the quality has been cut or some things have been missed, what happens a couple of years down the line when, something hasn't been done right, and you need to do expensive repairs. So there can a couple ways to look at it, whether you should certify or not. And these were the reasons for me.
Great answer. I would just like to kind of piggyback on that a little bit. So one of the first things we like to do as designers is to change the shape of the building and make things easier, make things more simple, do a little bit of design optimization. And that makes the payback equation a little bit different, because it's not necessarily what's the payback to take house A to passive house, right? It's we like house A. What is it going to take to get us to passive house? And so that's going to change the equation a little bit. And then also, I love what you said about certification. And for those of you who don't know, the certifier should be hired by the building owner, not by the designer. And so that kind of changes the interest a little bit, as the certifier is working for the owner, not working for the designer. So it's that extra set of quality assurance eyes that are on your project. And for those of you who haven't dived into PHPP yet, there are 10,000 plus entries in PHPP. And if you get one assumption wrong, you miss a decimal somewhere, that can lead to some problems as well. So it's certainly a quality assurance thing. We had a question come in from Scott about how long does certification take? Well, go ahead, Vlad. How long did your process take once you submitted everything to the certifier?
Once I submitted everything to the certifier, I think it took not even 2 months. I think I submitted end of August last year, or no, that was 2020. And in October, I received a positive answer from them. But that also depends on, how complete your documentation is, if you've made any errors in your PHP or anything like that. So depends on how much back and forth you have with your certifier.
I would agree with that. I would say it's probably about 2 months from you'll get the plaque, right, with within 2 months if everything is good to go and you have you've submitted all of your documentation correctly to the certifier, and it's a smooth process. And so Jay has come back here and says, how do we respond to a homeowner who's asking for what's the payback for doing this? Do you have any quick comments on that?
Yeah, me being a homeowner and designer at the same time, have I asked myself that question? Not that much. I mean, you could calculate that in the designer training. There's a section on economics of doing a passive house, and you can certainly calculate that for your client and compare different envelopes and different systems that you're installing in your passive home versus the traditional home. But I haven't heard this from lately from my clients. I don't think there was a primary question from them. I don't know what your experience is, Matt.
Yeah, my experience is pretty similar to that. Usually they're doing it for another reason than for economic payback. Because you can build a code built house really, really inexpensively. So it really just comes down to the other aspects of passive house that usually push a client over the edge to do passive house, right? It's the indoor air quality, it's the noise control, it's the daylighting, it's the high performance comfort, and then low energy bills on top of that, and building durability, and the list goes on and on and on.
Right.
So, yeah. And I guess we've got a minute or so left here. So just real quick, Vlad, when was the last time you changed your Zender filters?
Last time when the Zender system prompted me to, I think it was after this winter. Yeah, the chime came on and the sign came on the controller saying I'm supposed to change the intake filters, and I've done that. I usually open it up and try to vacuum them to see if that could be done. And after about few vacuuming, then you need the new set of filters. So I would say this spring was when I changed them last. How about
That's
you, Matt?
yeah. So I also live in a passive house, and it's that time of year. The cottonwood's flying, so it's time to check those filters. It's time to check that exterior grill. And yeah, it's you can never check them too much, and just don't make sure you have filters on hand, because you don't want to be one of those people who takes your supply filter out, vacuum it out, and put it in the extract air side of your system, right? We want clean
Right.
filters on both sides of the unit at least twice a year. So
Exactly.
yeah, exactly. So thank you everybody for listening. Feel free to reach out to Vlad or myself if you've got questions for other projects that you might be working on, or anything else that you have interest in.
Perfect. Thank you everyone for attending, and enjoy the conference.